Welcome, everybody, to the next episode of Consciously Unbiased is LinkedIn Live. I'm Ashish, Kaushal, the founder and CEO of a diversity staffing firm called HireTalent and the founder of Consciously Unbiased, a movement to build belonging in the workplace. Today's a special topic for me because it really is kind of where we started. It's about how to break the bias. We all have biases. It's part of being human. Some biases help us by speeding up our decision-making processes, while others hold us back by impacting who we are. Promote bias and even approach to be our friend. Today's conversation will cover how to break the bias, including behavioral and neuroscience behind unconscious bias, anecdotes, stories about how unconscious bias shows up in the workplace and with our personal journeys, the benefits of overcoming bias in the workplace, both from a people and business standpoint, and then finally some action steps on how to become more aware and better address our biases. Today's special guests are Dr. Stefanie Johnson. She's Associate Professor of INCLUSIFY and a best-selling author. Samantha-Rae Dickenson. She's the CEO of DSRD Consulting. Donna, Dockery, who is a key member of our team and anti-racism education consultant. And then Stephen Chu, who is an account executive of state and local government at Microsoft. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you.
So Samantha, let's start with you. Can you start off by telling us a little bit more about who you are and then also share a time when bias has impacted you personally?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Ashish, Holly, and the Consciously Unbiased team. First, I want to say thank you for creating the space for such an important topic and for having us here today. As Ashish said, my name is Dr. Samantha-Rae Dickenson. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I am the CEO and lead consultant at DSRD Consulting. And at my firm, we help organizations invest in their marginalized employees and create more inclusive work environments. Just to talk a little bit about bias, and I know we'll transition to microaggressions, but I've experienced microaggressions that I know stem from unconscious biases, but I wasn't too sure if it was because of my age, my sex, my race, or a combination of the three. I've had experiences where it was assumed that I was a secretary and not the leader of my team. I've been labeled as not being a team player, for example, because I didn't want to go to happy hours or was a little bit more introverted than everyone else on the team. I didn't want to talk about my dating life, stuff like that. People have constantly doubted my competence and my knowledge, despite knowing like my educational background and my experiences. Everything I did was questioned in certain work settings. So those are just some examples. And I'm sure as we continue the conversations, I can share a little bit more. Thank you.
Absolutely welcome. It sounds like people make a lot of assumptions that aren't correct about you, which is really unfortunate. Donna, I'd love to hear from you.
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you, Ash, for having me here. I am an anti-racism educator. I'm one of the facilitators at Consciously Unbiased, facilitating really difficult discussions with different companies. I also have my own consulting company. For myself, I'm also a doctorate student studying diversity trainings in the workplace and their impact on ethnic identity. So for myself, I could have basically dittoed everything that Dr. Samantha said with her experiences. I have not been seen as someone who could lead a clinical team. I have been assumed to be someone who works in the office rather than one of the clinicians. I've been told I look too young to be in certain positions. All of the above I've experienced. So it's hard to have people not doubt you. I've had people ask me where I got my degrees from because they didn't believe that they were actually real, or send me copies, or send me all types of things to solidify exactly who I am and the things that I do. So it comes up regularly, especially in the field of psychology, where I'm normally the only or one of the few people of color in the room.
Well, welcome. It's good to have you here. Dr. Johnson, I'd love to hear from you next.
Hi all, I'm Stefanie Johnson. I'm a professor of management at the University of Colorado in Boulder's Lead School of Business and the author of a book on how to create more diverse and inclusive workplaces called INCLUSIFY. And let's see, I think maybe there's so many examples of bias, but one of the ones that stands out to me that's just maybe a little different than what we've heard already is I experienced a lot of systemic bias and racism just from my upbringing. I'm Mexican American. I grew up in Los Angeles, outside of East LA, and experienced all of the, welfare, finding money for applying for college, and even paying for college myself, and being the first person in my family to go to college. It was like a lot of challenges. And I think one of the things that stands out to me for unconscious bias is that maybe because I present white and I'm a college professor, people make the opposite assumption. Like, it's really easy to assume that's not the case. And I don't think this is as hurtful of a manifestation of bias as the opposite, because I also get the, hey, hun, can you get me a glass of wine? And I'm like, maybe, but I'm about to teach this class because I'm the professor. And I think that's far worse. But certainly I've been in many of these conversations around bias where people are like, well, it's really easy for, a privileged white professor to talk about bias, and not recognizing that those assumptions aren't always valid either.
No, absolutely. And Steve, welcome. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too.
Thank you for having me. I'm Steve Chu. I'm an account executive at Microsoft on the state and local government team. We focus on helping state governments empower their people to provide better services for their citizens. And it encompasses a wide variety of topics and venues, ranging from law enforcement to child welfare to unemployment insurance to just helping their employees and government be more productive. My experience, I am nearly half German and half Chinese. I grew up in a small town in Alaska and experienced some pretty harsh racism for being a Chinese person. And at a young age, I developed the mindset that, I'm half German. It sure is a lot easier to show up as a German person. In fact, I think I'm going to get ahead in life if I do that. So at a very young age, I came home and told my parents that, hey, I'm done being Chinese. I'm just going to be a German person. In fact, I'd like you to change my last name. And I continued that mentality growing up and then entering the professional world and then becoming a sales professional. And I, for a long time, just continued to show up as a white person. And the leadership at Microsoft over the last few years has really encouraged us to be authentic, to show up to work in our true authentic selves. And so I started to learn about diversity and inclusion, allyship, covering a lot of the topics relative to what we're talking about with bias today. In fact, I took Dr. Johnson's LinkedIn Learning course, which is spectacular. I highly recommend it. But I started to realize I'm actually a happier person if I show up as my true authentic self. I'm half German and half Chinese. I have a lot to offer my employer, my customers. And so I started doing this discovery to show up as this true authentic self. And it meant really addressing a lot of the biases, not only that I had about other people, but about myself. That's been a little bit about my journey.
Wow, that's amazing. It is fascinating because I don't think people realize that what society and what media does to us makes us sometimes run away from our identities, right, as a result of it. And so I think we really need to change that and sort of see people for who they are and stop trying to categorize them and put them in boxes, Dr. Johnson, I love the word inclusify. I think that's brilliant. I'd love to hear your thoughts on when you hear the word consciously unbiased, what does it say to you?
Well, I love that title because I think, as you said at the start, we all have unconscious bias, right? They're paired associations. We use them to navigate the, millions of pieces of information that we're confronted with. And so that is the norm, right? But I would say, for my organization, that's not an acceptable norm to let unconscious bias impact your decisions. So you have to be consciously unbiased. It's kind of like being an anti-racist. You need to say, first, there is bias. Everyone has it, which probably means I do too, as a typical human. And therefore, I have to work harder to make better decisions, which is, not unlike everything else we do. If you're trying to do a good job in your workplace, you can do the easy get it done, or you can do the excellent. And I think when it comes to employment decisions or leadership, doing the excellent is really being consciously unbiased and being, I think that's kind of what I was going for with Inclusify too, but you have to be consciously inclusive, because the unconscious, the norm is to not to be exclusive, to be in-group focused and push out groups out. And so if you want to do better and be better, then it means being consciously, actively inclusive and unbiased.
I love it. That's a great explanation. Samantha, how about you? What does the word say to you? What does the phrase say to you?
I just echo what Dr. Johnson said. Because biases are a naturally occurring process, we have to make the conscious decision to unlearn the negative stereotypes that we've been conditioned to learn. So being unbiased is a conscious decision that we each have to make daily. We have to wake up and consciously choose to show up in a space where we're receptive of people who don't look like us, people we don't typically see, and be open-minded instead of clinging to those stereotypes that we've developed.
Absolutely. Donna, you have a lot around this.
I do. I think being consciously unbiased is tied to my research on ethnic identity. So consciously understanding who you are and what you bring to the space, consciously making that effort, making decisions to say, who am I and what do I bring into the world? How am I impacting other people? But also, how do people see me? So being more conscious of that part of yourself. So everything that Dr. Samantha and Dr. Stefanie said, I 100% agree with.
Absolutely. And Stephen, what does it say to you?
So I believe that we all have biases, and there will be a point in the future where I am insensitive to someone, and I'll discover that I have a bias that I was not aware of. And I think that we need grace, and we need the ability to have some introspective reflection on a scenario where we might exhibit a biased belief or behavior, and then learn and grow from it. Additionally, I think that we should apply a lot of grace to people when they exhibit biases and they're just not fully aware of how they impact ourselves or other people. We don't have to shame them, but it's an opportunity to appropriately address the bias, but also help people learn and grow.
I love that you said that, because I do think, if you think a lot of the training that's out there today, we're taught biases are bad, right? And if you pay attention to the training, you're stemmed in guilt. And so guilt to us changes some people, but I think the majority of us want to be inspired or take ownership of what our responsibilities are, right? And so we always say, consciously unbiased, we always say biases, not all biases are bad. They're based on life experiences, our family values, our community, our friends, and part of it is about survival. So let's own it, let's be proud about it, but now let's just learn how to apply it in the right situations. And it's not reasonable to say we're not going to have biases, right? Because if you didn't, it's a way for you to make shortcuts from your brain from what you're receiving in terms of input. And so every time you drank a cup of coffee, you'd burn yourself if you didn't judge if it was hot or not. So I feel like if we look at it that way, then when we teach you a new bias, you just add it to your toolbox of experiences and apply, and then just make an active effort to apply it in the right situations. And so that's kind of where our training sort of stems on. There's a lot of talk about microaggressions in the workplace. Microaggressions are indirect, subtle, and unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group. Can you share a time when you experienced a microaggression or witnessed one, and how did you respond? And it doesn't have to be necessarily that you experienced one, but if you saw one, how are you active to make sure it was resolved? Who would like to go first?
I can go.
Okay.
A story that I always tell in our consciously unbiased training is a story when I was at my final clinical placement, which was a year-long placement, and I was working and hustling like everybody else, and my supervisor had a meeting with me and said that I come off as if I have an attitude and that I isolate myself from my peers. And she asked me if because I was the only Black person there. And that impacted me greatly, because for the following year, and basically I was isolating myself. What she said when I inquired about it was how and where I sat in the room and how I sat in relation to other people. And so for the next year, what I did was I silenced myself. I never spoke, because I didn't know what it was about my voice that came off as if I had an attitude problem. I also kind of checked where and how I sat in the room, like, oh, let me sit next to Samantha today, let me sit next to Dr. Stefanie today, to let me make sure I'm not isolating myself and how I sit in the room. It was exhausting to have that experience. And I don't think she realized what she did for that entire year. And the result was I potentially lost, experiences because nobody knew what I had to offer because I was quiet. I only spoke when I was spoken to, which is unfortunate. And that happens to a lot of people of color in the workplace. You get one tiny microaggression, but it impacts your behavior, how you see yourself, how you see other people, how you go about your business.
And how did you overcome that, or what changed to make sure your voice is being heard?
Unfortunately, in that experience, I don't think I did, because I was very concerned with maintaining my placement, right? Because in that same conversation, she was like, I don't know if this is the right place for you. So that frightens me because I need this to graduate, right? So at that moment, I didn't know what to do. I told people about it, but it was easier for me this is the person who signs off on all my paperwork, to keep my head down and do my best to manage around her than for me to address her in any type of way, knowing that a lot of times that elicits fragility and that could backfire on me. And I didn't have the space or the ability to have that type of conversation in the position that I was.
Oh, wow.
Which is unfortunate, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Samantha, what about your experience?
Sure. I have a ton of examples, but I'll just list two. So I've had someone at work constantly ask me about my hair. So I like to change my hair a lot. I get bored, I change it, I do a bunch of styles. It's easy for me to do it. Every time I showed up with a new hairstyle, I was asked, is that how your hair grows out of your head? Every single time. And I noticed in the moment, I didn't feel any kind of way, but then I noticed my coworker, who wasn't Black, dyed and cut their hair. And the comments were, oh, wow, your hair frames your face so lovely. And I love those highlights. It looks so amazing. And after that, I started to notice that there was a very stark difference between the commentary towards me and towards my non-Black colleagues. So I realized later that those were microaggressions. And it did make me feel, it started to make me feel like I questioned how I showed up in the workplace and how people viewed me. So that was one example. And another example was during an interviewing process, a recruiter commented on how surprised he was that I was able to counter a job offer so professionally. And again, this kind of aligns with what I said earlier about people kind of doubting my abilities despite knowing my professional and educational experiences. And it just kind of caught me off guard that it was such a surprise because it wasn't my first job. And I didn't have my doctorate. So it's like, what do you mean by professional? So there were just so many layers to that experience. And then the recruiter went on to say, are you sure you want to move so quickly? Aren't you afraid of the background check? And I was just like, why would I be afraid? Why would I be afraid? And why do you ask that to all applicants? So those little, again, probably to the people saying it, they probably didn't realize that it could be offensive, discriminatory, rooted in like racial stereotypes. But when you move about life and you constantly hear these types of things, and then those comments aren't the same to people who don't look like you, so to non-Black people, it makes you feel kind of othered and excluded and sort of like targeted. And the way in which I deal with microaggressions. So when I was a little bit younger, I didn't know how to deal with them because just like Donna said, you kind of have to do like a risk assessment to determine, is it even worth saying anything? Are people going to believe me? Is this going to put a target on my back? Should I just try to make them feel comfortable so that they don't call me out as often or so that I don't stick out as often? But now I encourage people to challenge those microaggressions if they feel comfortable doing so in the moment. And the way I do that is to ask, why are you so surprised that I was professional? Or why did you make that comment about my hair? Where is that coming from? And it kind of catches them off guard and it makes them stop and think like, why did I say that? What made me make that comment? So that's the advice I give to people when they always ask, like, what do we do with microaggressions? How do we respond to them in the moment? And to be honest, it takes a lot of training. Like you have to be secure or comfortable enough to ask those questions in a moment and not be afraid, I guess, because you don't know how the other person will react. So those are some of my experiences in how I handle microaggressions.
Yeah, I love both your examples. It gives two different perspectives. I think one is you've shown how you can actually respond and take it on. And then the second one is if with Donna's experience, if somebody's in a position of power who has ultimate authority, it's really hard to push back. So I think it's us as other members of the class should have said, hey, and sort of responded to that and sort of pulled her back in, because I think there are limits to what we can do ourselves sometimes. And so we need the power of the community to help us. Dr. Johnson, what are your experiences around this? And I'd love to hear one if you have one on how you actively help someone who had a microaggression against them.
Absolutely. I can't believe that those stories, Dr. Samantha. That's like unbelievable. The background check. There's just like a couple of themes that I see. One is if you're othering someone, like, oh, that's so different about you. I think that's a way that we see microaggressions happen. And then the other is like those backhanded compliments. Like you're quite professional. And it's like, compared to what, like that's the point you're grounding it in someone's difference. And I like your point as well, Ash, that we need to be standing up for other people in these contexts too, because when you're the one constantly getting hit with these microaggressions, like sometimes it's exhausting, right? And it's nice to be able to have the strength to say, like, what do you mean? Tell me more about your thoughts, or like meet it with an empathetic ear. Can you tell me why you said that? Or, say, hey, for me, that experience makes me feel othered. But like after some days, I think you just don't have it in you to do that. And so there's times where I think, and I've experienced this as a teacher, I'm standing in a classroom and we'll say, for argument's sake, a white male student makes a comment like that toward a female student, like, oh, well, you're being a little bit aggressive here. And I think like that, I think it's hard for that woman in the moment to say, like, why are you calling me aggressive? Like that's a gendered comment. You're only making that comment because it's a woman. So I feel like for me, oftentimes in these situations, it's like you have to step in and say, let's pause here. Let's talk about what you're experiencing and why you're saying that she's aggressive. Would you make that same comment if a man were saying it? And in some instances, depending on the dynamics of the room, that's a conversation you need to have later, not in front of everyone. But I think sometimes it's also important to have it in the moment, because if you let it pass, then you've just taught everyone else that kind of comment's okay. And even if it makes that student feel uncomfortable, or that, colleague feel uncomfortable in the moment, I think as long as you're coming at it with an empathetic stance and trying to learn more and explain and teach, I think it's like, this is what we have to be doing. This is 2021. Like maybe 5 years ago, I would always wait to do it outside of the room. But I think we all have just like a higher expectation for being allies and supporting diversity and inclusion, that I think we just need to be, I call it calling people in, but we just need to be calling people in more to heighten awareness.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just real quickly, if I had known, to go off of what Samantha and Dr. Stefanie said, if I had known what I know now and had the confidence that I had now, I probably would have asked, exactly what did I say that made you think I had an attitude? Or what was my demeanor? Or what was the situation? And I probably would have questioned her further on when she said it's how and where I sit in the room. Well, what seat should I be sitting in? What is the appropriate seat? Or who should I be sitting next to not make it look like I'm isolating myself? Or can you expand on that idea? But in the moment I was so, oh my gosh, I have to keep this internship. I have to continue this work to graduate. I didn't have that ability, but now I'm way more confident. And I would tell somebody else in that situation to have those same questions and to challenge it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's why it's critical to have support in a support group, and that we're active about this. Steve, do you have an example as well?
Absolutely. I'll share a couple points along the journey. So going back to being an Asian and Chinese person showing up as a German and Chinese person showing up as a white person, I learned that it was not safe to react when people would make jokes about Asian people growing up. And I reached a point a few years ago where I realized I don't have to laugh. I don't have to accept a joke that is racist or that is a microaggression towards Asian people. Yes, I don't necessarily look like the Chinese person in the room, but I am Chinese and you're talking about my people when you make a negative joke like that. And so learning to just react in the moment, I've carried that sentiment relative to the pandemic and the coronavirus. About a year ago, I wrote an article on LinkedIn called "I Am Not a Virus." And I don't mean anything to say anything negative about elected officials, but a year ago, this time, it was it became much more acceptable to associate the COVID-19 virus with China and Chinese people. And it just started off a litany of xenophobia across the country, where people started to learn that they felt like it was okay to call the virus, a name associated with Chinese people. And unfortunately, it just has exacerbated racist outbursts towards Chinese and Asian people. And so I wrote this article and I felt like I just had this platform to make a stand and to be an ally to people. It really wasn't impacting me directly, but I saw it impacting other Asians across the country. And so it started a public dialogue for me, but it also broke off into a lot of individual one-off conversations. And some of the conversations really didn't go well, but in one conversation, the gentleman just wasn't aware of how he was impacting Asian people by making comments about the COVID virus being associated with Chinese people or making jokes about it. And I helped him realize that, yeah, this is impactful. If you look at what's happening in other communities where elderly Asian people that are defenseless are being assaulted, what you're saying perpetuates the thought that it's okay to hurt Asian people. And so I was able to see one individual say, I didn't see that before, I see that now. And I hope that I never treat an Asian person like that again. In fact, if I have an opportunity to stand up for them, I will.
I love that. You're very active about making sure you're taking a stand on this. And I think it's even the story that you talked about in the beginning about laughing. I always tell people we have this thing called microprogressions. It's ideas of how you can actively overcome, take small action steps to help overcome bias in the workplace. And so one of the examples I give is if somebody tells you a joke that might be somewhat racist, if you laugh, that person feels empowered to do this, right? But if you don't laugh, and even let's take that first basic step. If you don't laugh, it makes them feel uncomfortable. But number two, it subconsciously starts programming yourself to overcome this bias, right? Because you've actually started reprogramming your brain and saying, okay, this is not cool, And I think, and if you want to take the next step is actually speaking out against it. But I think you take baby steps to try to get there. But I think it's important, because it actually does two things at the same time, which I think is super powerful. Do you guys have any advice on how to tell if you're making a microaggression? Because we're all sort of guilty of that at different times.
I'll jump in here, and I don't know if it helps you tell if you're making a microaggression, but it's pretty funny that you said that, Ashish, because this is a question that people have asked me a lot. I'm pretty sure I'm making microaggressions, but I know no one's going to tell me. And my question isn't I can run through some common microaggressions, and maybe we should do that. I think that's good learning. But I think it's the second half of that statement that is the bigger point, that no one will tell you. Why would no one tell you? I think this is something that you can create an environment of psychological safety where you tell people, your team, I want to know if I am making statements that are microaggressions. And so I want to empower you to tell me. I will listen with an open ear. And when you tell me, I will say thank you. And if you actually do those things, then I think similar to your comment about training, I think you're also training people and positively reinforcing that communication pathway that if I do say, I'm going to say something wrong, Of course I am. I don't know everything about everything. And so the bigger issue to me is that I'm going to do it and the person doesn't feel empowered to say anything, so I can't correct it. Because I wonder, even with soon to be Dr. Donna, that your experience, if someone said that to you and then you were able to correct it, maybe it wouldn't have had the same long lasting impact. It would have made you feel like more empowered to speak up in the future, and could have actually, I mean, it's still not great to experience the microaggressions, but it seems like a better outcome if you have an environment where people can actually just like learn.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think to add to what Dr. Stefanie said is a lot of times you don't know when you're doing a microaggression, but you have to be so enthusiastic about trying not to do microaggressions that you allow that environment of safety that people could check you and be like, actually, you shouldn't say that for that reason. So when you are an enthusiastic leader and say, we're going to do this and we're going to change our environment and change the way we behave and change the way we treat each other, and we're going to set up this safety net so we can all call each other out, I think that is a good thing to have. But when you don't have that, it's hard to tell when you're doing a microaggression because you don't know you're doing it. And sometimes, like in my case, the other person is not going to tell you, you just did a microaggression against me. And then the other people around you, like your colleagues, may not feel safe enough to do so.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Samantha, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to say one simple thing is to just think before you speak, especially if you're interacting with someone that you don't typically interact with, someone who looks different than you, who grew up in a different environment, who practices a different religion, whatever the difference is, to just think before you speak and ask yourself, would I ask this same question to someone who does look like me? Or would I make this comment or this joke and feel comfortable with what I say in different settings? And I think that's one way, but I agree with what everyone else has said. Once you are aware of unconscious biases and how they show up, then you should take the extra step to educate yourself further on different types of biases. And that way you have some sort of foundational awareness of what it looks like in different settings. And that's one step closer to avoiding committing them, because I actually just made a post about ableism. And there's some stuff that I didn't know that I say that's ableist, phrases that's normal that everyone says. And I'm pretty sure a lot of people don't know that it's ableist, but I Googled it and I learned, and I saw one person say something about it, and it prompted me to keep trying to learn because I didn't know. So that's my advice, or like what I want to offer.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Yeah. The phrases like blind leading the blind, or that's tone deaf, or what I said fell on deaf ears. Those are all phrases that are ableist phrases, and they kind of perpetuate the negative stigma that is attached to people with disabilities. So yeah, don't say those anymore.
I think those are definitely subtle ones where we're not really aware of it. So those are important to figure out. But I think the first step to sort of overcoming this is a gut check, right? If you don't feel warm inside after you release something out of your mouth, then learn from it and say, I'm not going to do that again, right? I think we all have sort of a gut that tells us that things don't feel good. And so we should try to listen to it a little bit more.
I love the point that Dr. Samantha said about, like, would you say this in another space? Yeah. I like to say, if you were walking around with a microphone, would you be saying these comments out loud? If it wasn't me in the room, if it was somebody else, if you were just in the supermarket talking loudly, would you say that? And if not, or if you would have any type of like hesitation, then think about that comment or think about that action so you could figure out exactly why you want to say that in other areas, because it might be offensive.
That's a great point. Yeah. Would you say it on stage?
I think that's very true for some of the statements that people make, but for some of the ones that are like blind, like, one of the leading scholars on unconscious bias wrote a book, Blind Spot, right? And I think people don't know that, they don't see the ableism there, that you're associating something negative, or like the one I am super guilty of. And I saw your post, Dr. Dickenson, that about the ableist terms, but it's crazy that, people are crazy. Like, that can be super offensive. And I think some of the ones that when people think they're giving you a compliment, they would say it from the rooftops, like, wow, you look so young to be a professor. And I used to be younger, but I think like, I'm sure they would say that out loud because they think they're being nice. And so there is the warm fuzzies and like, you're saying something that maybe is not quite right. But there's also so much education because I'll say like post Me Too, people still make those comments and they preface it with, hopefully I'm not Me Tooing you, but I have to say you look really great in those jeans. And it's like, you knew you weren't supposed to say that. That's why you prefaced it, but you still chose to say it. So I think there's kind of both, right? There's like some base level of education. And then there's also like, I don't know why people still want to say the comments that they know they shouldn't say.
Absolutely. What can people do who experience unconscious bias or microaggressions in the workplace?
I love, so for instance, I love when Dr. Samantha gave her story, because I'm like, oh, that, like, she's my people, like somebody that I could talk to. She's experienced it herself. There's somebody else that could make you feel like you're not crazy. What was helpful to me is that when I would experience these little microaggressions, I'd be like, what is that? Do I have an attitude? Do I isolate myself? And then talking to another professor or talking to a friend or talking to anyone to tell them about it and be like, oh no, that's not you. That wasn't you. That was wrong. Makes me feel better. And then I have more agency to go back in and come back and say, when you said that to me the other day, it was inappropriate for these reasons. So having somebody to confirm your experience is always good, at least for me.
Yeah.
I have to +1 that because I think that the worst, and I feel like going back to the sexual harassment Me Too thing, I think the reason sexual harassment was so pervasive in the workplace is because women were just gaslit for years. Like, oh, you're so sensitive. Oh, you think you're pretty special, right? That this everyone's always hitting on you. Wow, you must be something hot. And I think as soon as Me Too started, the power of that was you're like, oh, I knew it wasn't just me, but I have been keeping this in for all these years because I thought that, I shouldn't tell anyone because I'm going to get viewed negatively of like, well, what did you do to elicit that? And I think the same thing we need to see more of around racial bias and particularly anti-Black bias in America, because these comments are everywhere. And I sit on panels with women of color who they share similar experiences. And then there's always folks in the chat saying like, oh, I thought that was just me. So it's like, we need more of these conversations so that people know that it's not just them and how others have dealt with it in the past and why it's not just like, let it slide. It's like, this is 2021. I think, come on, we got to be addressing these things and people have to start learning. It's like, it's a little late, right? I think it's time.
No, and you bring up some good points. I think we have to unnormalize it, right? We used to say it's socially acceptable to harass women, and especially in the workplace, right? Or make comments on how they look and things like that. And so we have to turn that into an unnormal comment, so that way people know not to do that anymore instead of making it socially acceptable.
But also, if the other person committing the microaggression or the bias knew the impact they were having, that's why I like to highlight the emotional, the psychological, the behavioral impact of these small comments, because if the other person knew that they were causing all this harm, they likely wouldn't do it. But since they don't have that understanding, it's like, yeah, racism is bad, or my intentions, I didn't mean it that way, so I'll be okay. They don't understand their intentions versus impact. They just go about their business. But no, this is a huge issue. When you have somebody walk, from my case, a year silence, that's significant. That has significant impact.
So Donna, let's unpack that a little further. So if you were like in the workplace specifically, why does this matter? Like, how does it affect employees and productivity and things like that? Like, what does it do if we don't address these things?
Yeah, well, productivity goes down. If I'm distracted by looking at how I sit in the room, then I'm not focused on what I'm supposed to be doing. Or if I'm focused on changing my personality, which is a lot of times code switching in order to fit this little box, I may be distracted and not doing other things that I should be doing. If I feel uncomfortable in the workplace, stress leads to health issues. So if I'm stressed and I don't feel comfortable in the workplace mentally, everything is connected. So it's going to impact my mood and my now, I wasn't mad. I didn't think I have an attitude before, but now I have an attitude now because you said that to me. So now I have an attitude because now I'm upset about it, but I still have to show up and I still have to operate, and I may not be doing my job as well as I was before because I'm distracted by all these other things.
Yeah, so it directly affects productivity.
And I'd like to follow up with what Donna just said. It's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you call out something negative that's not there, then the person just focuses on that thing and then it actually comes to fruition. And I actually did my doctoral research on this very topic. So the title of my research was how microaggressions negatively affect Black women, Black government workers, and their work performance. And so the results were that obviously Black women experience microaggressions in the workplace, and a number of the participants mentioned that because of these preconceived stereotypes of Black women, it made them walk on eggshells at work and feel like they had to work 10 times as harder than their non-Black colleagues. They also were less engaging with their coworkers. They hated their jobs, but they had to stay for financial security, which aligns with what Donna said. She needed that that internship, or what was it, an internship
Yes.
to fulfill like the requirements for her degree. And that's the case for a lot of people. They just stay and deal with it because job security, financial security, it's hard to get another. And then you have to face biases when you're interviewing for jobs and applying for jobs. So there's just so many layers that unconscious biases, they affect so many different things. So it's like a domino effect, basically.
No, absolutely.
I have to echo all of that. I think the self-fulfilling prophecy is a great insight. Like the having people focusing on all of these other little things that they're not doing. Like think of the cognitive demand of, rather than processing information in the room and giving your perspective, which is like the benefit of having you in that room is to get your perspective. Instead, you're sitting there going, wait, am I smiling? Am I looking friendly? What's the tone I'm deliver this with? I have to begin with, that's a great point, and I'm going to disagree because, and like modulate your voice to try to feel like it's going to be more well accepted instead of just being able to be. And then the other thing I would add to all of those great points that you both made is it's painful. Like there are neuropsych studies that show the same area of your brain when you're excluded in that way light up when you're experiencing physical pain. And so, I think, Donna, your point of like, if people just knew they wouldn't do it, I think there's truth to that. Like if people knew you're actually hurting someone that you purport to care about and as your colleague, maybe they would just put in the effort. And maybe it's that, it's like awareness and then like, and are you willing to put in the effort to do a better job? Because it's going to boost productivity and not cause harm.
That's a great point. Any advice on managing our bias and once we're aware of it? So now that I know I do it, how do I actually solve that and make it a habit?
I came up with four things. So I'm on LinkedIn a lot, clearly, but I post about how to unlearn unconscious biases. So always, anything related to DEI topics, areas, always educate yourself. Learn about different cultures, religions, races, sexual orientations, any group that is different than the group that you belong to and identify as. Also expanding your friend circle. So meet people that don't look like you. Reach out and network with people that look different. Next, I have some notes. Intertwine yourself with different cultures, but make sure not to appropriate those cultures. And then also, there's a term called individuation, which is you basically gather information about the person you're meeting so that your negative stereotypes and biases don't show up. So if you learn about that individual person, it kind of replaces any type of stereotypes you have about their race or religion or sexual orientation. And then lastly, replacing those negative stereotypes. So instead of saying, wow, you're very articulate, you can say, I really appreciate your comment and what you added to the topic. Or just whatever thoughts you have about a specific group, Google it and see if it's true and see what pops up. And that ties into the education piece.
So can I ask you a further question to that? So you talked about cultural appropriation, right? So where's the line between cultural appropriation and embracing your culture? Because I identify with it more than I identify with mine, maybe.
Yeah. Everyone asks that question. And to be honest, sometimes I struggle with what that balance is. But I think appropriation is when you are profiting off of somebody else's culture and you're not aware of any type of historical context that may have negatively impacted that group or that culture. So for example, I'll just use Black women because I'm a Black woman. Wearing braids in the workplace, like people get fired for that. They get discriminated for that. And then if you're not aware of that and you just walk around with braids and you're like, I look good and this is my hairstyle, like you're just not in tune with what's happening. So I think that's how you can gauge if it's appropriating. Also, if you copy something from a culture and don't give credit to the originators of whatever it is you're inspired by. I can't remember where I saw this, but there's some documentary about a fashion designer that there's a tribe that's somewhere in the Amazon. The fashion designer found out about the tribe. He went to the tribe and he just observed them. He credited them. He didn't copy their tribal patterns. He just used it as inspiration. So it wasn't the exact pattern, but you could see the similarities. And I think that's how you appreciate different cultures without appropriating it.
Interesting. Donna or Samantha, Stefanie, do you have any thoughts around that?
No, I was going to 100% agree with Dr. Samantha said in that learning about people, asking questions, listening more than you talk, challenging your assumptions by doing a little bit of research. But also I have to throw my own research in there that I think is very important to know yourself and your ethnic identity and know what you come with and know your background and know where those biases might have originated from. So knowing yourself and everything that comes with you and how people see you will help you approach that other person better after you ask a lot of questions and learn about them and their cultures and their practices, or, what does your mama do? Like little questions will be easier when you know more about yourself and how you show up.
Absolutely.
I have probably less faith in people than you two. So I feel like, yes, do those things. Those are great. I'm like, I need to do more of those things too. And try to change systems so that there's less room for bias to step in. If it's taking names off resumes, or you're trying to use some hard metrics for who you're going to promote into, or you have in line for a high potential program. Like we often do that based on like the tap on the shoulder. This person seems like they're high potential. They've got leadership written all over them. And I would look at the data and see, are your systems creating bias? Like if you believe that talent is equally distributed, then you should not have any changes as you move up the organization. If you have 50% women at your entry level and 20% women of color, you should have 50% women and 20% women of color at the next level up. And if you don't, then there's a problem in your system. It's not treating people equitably. And so you need to revisit how those decisions are made with all of the other stuff as well. But the systems, I think if you can change the system in a way that reduces bias, and then you can increase goals around, like have specific numeric goals for what you're going for, and then have some serious accountability. Like you can tie people's success around diversity and inclusion to things like bonuses, because if you have really high differential turnover, you're losing all of the Black women from your organization, you're costing the organization money, and therefore you should be held accountable, just like we would be for anything else when it comes to costing organizations money. So I take out, I guess, that maybe a more HR business perspective of each of us need to do our part, and then the organization as a whole needs to be responsible and accountable.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think compensation drives behavior. So if you really want to make change happen within a company, you're going to has a tie to that. And I think even the tapping on the shoulder, that's just saying you're like me. So I see myself in you. So let's make them a leader because I'm a great leader, right? And that's, of course, I'm a great leader, even though I may not be. Right? So I think there's a Harvard professor that says a line that I really love. She goes, we have to get to a point in society where we're, instead of saying they're different than me, they're different like me, and realize that we're all actually different. And so if you get to that point where you associate, then you find the commonality and you start tapping people that may have different views, but they have something in common with you that shows you true leadership. You know? So let's talk about empathy and allyship, because I think the two of them are intertwined. And so how does empathy tie to allyship, and what in your mind are things that we could do to become a good ally? And let's give them a few tangible things for specific to work, and like, how do I become a better ally at work? Donna, you want to go?
Yeah, I can go. I was about to say. I think they're completely tied together, because once you, again, have that understanding of what that person is going through, then you could then be a good ally and step in and say, oh my gosh, I felt that way in this time in my life. And now I know, since I know how that feels, I can now be a better ally and step in. And to me, being a good ally is putting yourself in the mix of things and, putting yourself in the fight and taking some hits yourself. That is being a good ally.
In terms of empathy, I would say empathy allows us to remember that we're all humans, especially in the workplace. So it humanizes everyone and kind of allows us to take a step back and not view each other just by our titles or our roles in the company. And yeah, we won't be able to really understand everyone's experience, but if we approach things from a perspective of, oh, you're a human too, you have feelings, you have experiences, it allows us to give grace to others more freely. And how I would define allyship and what it means to be an ally to me, I came across this definition that Nicole Enfonium-Hara, she's the DEI program director at Mayo Clinic. I love her definition. It hits on all the spots, and I'll read it really quickly. So to me, an ally is a person of privilege who is proactive in unlearning and reevaluating their privilege and biases, and works in solidarity and partnership with a marginalized group of people to help take down the systems that challenge that group's basic rights, equal access, and ability to thrive in our society. So I feel like that hits on personal actions people can take, as well as what Dr. Johnson mentioned about taking down the systems and changing the system. So that's what I think an ally is, harnessing your power and privilege to affect those changes.
I love that definition. I think it nicely also points to the fact that you're not a savior as an ally. That's one of the missteps that I talk about in INCLUSIFY, is that you're helping lift people up. You're not carrying them, right? That's actually not what people need or want, honestly. And then I think the other thing that maybe even isn't in that definition that you said, Dr. Dickenson, that is so important, is like the actually getting to know people. Like, there's a real problem if you're going to work and doing this work, but you're not living it. And I'll say in my research for the CEOs I studied for the book, INCLUSIFY, is that they were living it. And it's not always easy. Like as a very white presenting person I have that privilege, and I live in Boulder, Colorado, which I don't know if you've ever been to, but it's like, there's like a lot of white people in Boulder, Colorado. People say this all the time. Like, well, I would love, like, we have parenting and diversity groups, all these folks who are really committed to it, but they're like, well, I don't know people. And I think, yes, that's a challenge, but come on, smart people, like, you can get to know people outside of your hometown. And hopefully, there's diversity groups in all of our associations. And that's my tangible advice for allies is set a goal today to show up to 2 new, maybe just one, if you want a reasonable goal because it's COVID, but diversity group, if it's, Black at your organization or women in STEM or, whatever it is for you, show up. Even if you don't think that you fit that group, that's the whole point of allyship, right? Like, we can all be allies for each other, and we need majority group members to step into this conversation, because when we know that diversity and inclusion benefit organizations' bottom line, which they do, then everyone's benefiting from this outcome. We all need to be responsible for making it happen. And I know there's fear that you're going to show up at this event and people are going to say, are you in the wrong place? And just imagine for a moment how that feels every time one of those people walk into a room where no one looks like them, and own it. It's tough, and you're taking the risk to do it. And that's why this is like work, right?
Yep.
And I think it'll pay off dividends. And I think people will be super welcoming and happy that you're there, as long as you're there, you're there with the best of intentions.
Definitely. And there's a lot of strength and vulnerability, you know?
Absolutely. I mean, I teach this class. I always talk about this. It's called Women in Business. If I had it to do over again, I would have just called it inclusive leadership or something rather than women. But I had a man come to my class, and of course anyone can take it. I would love for more men to take the class, but he said, I can't take this class. I'm the only man. It's so weird. And the other women were like, I'm the only woman in my advanced econ class. I'm the only woman in my calculus 2 class. I'm the only, and he's like, it's different though to be the only woman. And they're like, oh, really not. And he's like, huh, you're right. It's probably not different. It's just societal norm. So it seems different because I'm usually the majority, but the experience is kind of the same. And I think it's probably even better. It's probably even nicer to be the only majority group member, because you get to leave that room and go back to your privilege, your normal lifestyle of every day. So I just like really, and I had total empathy for that, and give kudos for people who are willing to take that risk and do it. Just the impact, I think, is huge.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just highlighted something else that you reminded me of. So I think like one of the things we tend to do is like, okay, you haven't done it in the last 20 years, so why are you doing it now, right? And how are we ever going to move past anything unless we say, well, their intention's there, they're trying, they're showing up to a meeting they've never gone to. Let's give them the permission to try, right? And not challenge why they're trying, because that doesn't motivate us to change each other. We're quick to cancel, but not quick to educate, you know?
Yeah, thanks for saying that. I think that's true.
I think it's important to ask people sometimes why now, like what changed, what's bringing you here now, but also be accepting to them coming now, because better late than never.
Yeah. Yeah. So we talked about microprogressions before. Can you give me an example of one small action step that you as a leader can take to overcome bias in the workplace that you're going to do going forward?
I would say micro affirmations. So literally just affirming people of marginalized groups out loud. That's such a simple thing, but it has such a domino effect of positive reframing. So just imagine if, I don't know, someone from a marginalized group, if a leader yells out, wow, you're doing such a great job, or something that's not a microaggression, then everyone will start to emulate those same actions, and it'll kind of start a reframing and unlearning in everyone else's minds. And it normalizes the act of simply just affirming people instead of, oh, you're so smart to be, the fact that you talk so well, or you're so smart, and where you come from, it's just, you don't normally see that, or you're not that type of Black person, or wow, you speak English so well. Instead of those types of sentences, you will hear, wow, you're such a strong leader, or I love the way that you lead your team. Those are different affirmations that aren't rooted in microaggression. So I think something as simple as that is a great step forward.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, it's bringing people who look like me into my workplace. Right. So younger people, to like, seeing is believing. And so also my colleagues who don't normally see, whether it's clinicians of color or students of color, to come in and like, oh, look at all of these students who, or come in and look at all different colors and come from different walks of life, who can also do the work. So because a lot of times it's like, oh, you know, we don't have a lot of people of color because there's not a lot of students of color. We don't see them. They don't come here. All right, well, let me show you. Let me show you all the people that can actually come if you look for it. And then also affirming them. Like, this person is great at this. This student is really amazing at this. This student is amazing at this. I emailed Ash, a student, the other day. Like, I have this great student who's really good at this. Doing those types of things are microprogressions.
Absolutely. I love that.
I love those too. I don't know that I can say anything else, but I'll give my suggestion is if you take your Zoom meetings or WebEx or whatever you use, watch one of them and pay attention to who's speaking, who's getting spoken over, who's getting interrupted, whose ideas are being co-opted, and then change that. Like when you see that, once you see it, I promise you can't unsee it. You'll like, if you wrote it down, you'd be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I just spoke over him or her 15 times. And when you see the person who unmutes and mutes and unmutes and mutes because they're just trying to get a word in, next time, put in the chat, Donna, do you have something to say? Or even unmute yourself and say, Donna, I think you have something to add on this because you have this really unique perspective, having like gone through this whole PhD program. I want to hear what you have to say. And so that you're actively bringing people into the conversation, because when you're in it, it's so hard to see it. But once you see it, like it's seen, and you forevermore will recognize that inequity that's happening during meetings.
I love that. You know, it's funny because I never really thought about replaying what I've watched, what I've done, but I think that's brilliant, because one of the things I used to say with microprogressions is I had a tendency to cut people off when I was talking to them, right? And what does that signal? Because I want to get my ideas out, right? But what does that really send? So if I'm talking to you and I cut you off, it sends you a signal that you're not important to me subconsciously, and now your ideas aren't important to me. And it's not my intention, but that's what happens, right? And so now I actively, as a microprogression, I actively listen, pause, listen to your question, and make sure I answer what you asked instead of what I want to barf on you, essentially. And so I think that's a simple thing within a work environment that will really help with team building, right? And getting people to feel more activated and involved. But this is a great conversation. We should definitely do this again. Thank you all for taking the time to speak with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having us.
Have a wonderful day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.